At 1337 hours on December 12, 1937, the United States Navy gunboat USS Panay was riding at anchor on the Yangtze River approximately 27 miles above Nanking, China, flying an American flag from her stern and displaying two American flags painted prominently on her awnings, visible from the air. The position had been communicated to the Japanese military authorities operating in the area. The United States government had informed the Japanese military command of the Panay's location and her intention to remain in that position, while the fall of Nanking played out on the shore nearby. The flags were there to be seen. The communication had been made. The neutrality of the vessel under international law was as unambiguous as the diplomatic and procedural mechanisms of 1937 could make it. At that moment, Japanese Navy aircraft appeared overhead and began their bombing runs. What followed over the next 2 hours was an attack that killed 3 men, wounded 43 others, and sent the Panay to the bottom of the Yangtze River in 14 feet of water. It also produced a diplomatic crisis of sufficient severity that the question of whether the United States and Japan would go to war in December of 1937 rather than December of 1941 was one that could not be immediately dismissed. The answers to that question, and the reasons those answers were ultimately resolved in the direction of a grudging peace rather than an immediate war, illuminate the specific character of American and Japanese policy in that period with a precision that more famous events sometimes obscure. The Panay incident did not start a war. What it revealed, in the clarity that only a genuine crisis produces, was how far both governments would go to avoid starting one, and how much each government was willing to overlook in the name of that avoidance. The lessons of that calculation, made in December of 1937, were still being drawn upon in November of 1941, when the decisions that led to Pearl Harbor were being finalized. The Panay was in many ways the rehearsal for a drama whose final performance came 4 years later. The USS Panay was a river gunboat, designed specifically for the unique requirements of operating on the great rivers of China. She had been built at the Qiangnan Dock and Engineering Works in Shanghai, a construction choice that reflected the practical reality of getting such a vessel to her area of operations. River gunboats of her size and draft could not be built in American yards and then sailed to China through the open ocean. She was laid down in 1926 and commissioned on September 10, 1928. She measured 59 meters in length, with a beam of 9.9 meters and a displacement of 450 tons. Her twin propellers, driven by diesel engines producing 900 horsepower, gave her a maximum speed of 15 knots in favorable river conditions. Her draft was a shallow 1.8 meters, designed to allow navigation of the Yangtze during its lower water seasons, when the river's depth decreased substantially. Her armament reflected her role as a presence rather than a combatant in any serious sense. She carried 2 3-inch guns, 1 forward and 1 aft, and 8 .30-caliber Lewis machine guns on pedestal mounts along her sides. She was not designed to fight a naval battle. She was designed to be visibly American and visibly armed in Chinese waters, to deter interference with American nationals and commercial interests through the credible suggestion of force, and to provide a communications and administrative center for the small American naval presence on the Yangtze. She flew the American flag in a part of the world where the flag carried substantial diplomatic weight, and the weight she carried derived almost entirely from what the flag represented, rather than from the modest fighting power of her 3-inch guns. The Yangtze River Patrol that the Panay represented was itself the product of a specific diplomatic and commercial history. The treaty system that had been established between China and the Western powers following the Opium Wars of the 19th century had given Western nations the right to navigate Chinese inland waterways for commercial and diplomatic purposes, to maintain consular establishments in treaty ports, and to station naval vessels in Chinese waters for the protection of their nationals. These rights, collectively known as extraterritoriality, had been sources of Chinese resentment and nationalist grievance since the moment of their imposition, but they remained in force in 1937 as the legal framework within which American, British, French, Italian, and other Western naval vessels operated on Chinese rivers. The American presence on the Yangtze had been formalized through the Yangtze Patrol, a small force of river gunboats whose mission was exactly what the name suggested: patrolling the river, showing the flag, protecting American citizens and property, and maintaining the practical expression of American treaty rights in the region. The Panay was one of the larger and more modern vessels of this patrol. Her crew in December of 1937 numbered approximately 60 officers and men, supplemented on the day of the attack by a number of American civilians who had taken refuge on the gunboat as the Japanese forces closed on Nanking. Those civilians included journalists and newsreel cameramen, a fact whose significance would become apparent in the hours and days following the attack. Norman Alley of Universal Newsreels and Eric Mayel of Movietone News were both aboard the Panay when the attack occurred, and both managed to film portions of it. The existence of motion picture footage of a Japanese attack on an American government vessel, with the American flags plainly visible throughout, created an evidentiary situation that was unprecedented in the diplomatic history of the period, and that constrained the options available to the Japanese government in ways that less well-documented incidents had not. The fall of Nanking to Japanese forces, which occurred on December 13, 1937, the day after the Panay was sunk, was accompanied by atrocities against the Chinese civilian population that became known as the Nanking Massacre, or the Rape of Nanking. The scale of the killing and the violence committed against Chinese civilians by Japanese soldiers during the occupation of the city has been documented by numerous sources, including Western observers who remained in Nanking throughout the period and kept detailed records. The Panay incident took place in direct proximity to these events, and understanding the context requires acknowledging that Japanese military operations in the Nanking area in December of 1937 were characterized by a level of violence and disregard for conventional restraints that informed every American assessment of the Panay attack. The Panay had moved upriver from Nanking on December 9th as Japanese forces approached the city, taking aboard American civilians and consular officials who were evacuating. She was anchored with 3 standard oil tankers, the Meiping, the Mayan, and the Meicia, in a position that was clearly not in the combat zone and had been communicated to Japanese military authorities. The standard oil vessels were also flying American flags. The position of the small American flotilla in the river was unambiguous. What happened next has been the subject of substantial historical examination, and the records available from both American and Japanese sources have been analyzed with considerable care. The Japanese aircraft that attacked the Panay belonged to the 13th Naval Air Corps, operating from shore bases. The attack aircraft were Navy Type 96 carrier bombers, known to the Allies by the reporting name Nell, and they were accompanied by Navy Type 91 fighters providing escort. The bombing attack began at 1337 hours and continued for approximately 20 minutes. After the bombing, Japanese Army motor launchers approached the stricken vessel and opened fire with machine guns and small arms, killing additional wounded men on the deck and driving the survivors who had taken to lifeboats toward the shore. The attack killed Sandro Ciani, an Italian journalist who had taken passage on the Panay. It killed 1 American sailor, Seaman Second Class Edgar Hulsebus, during the attack itself, and it inflicted wounds on the Panay's commander, Lieutenant Commander James Joseph Hughes, and on the majority of the crew. A second American, sailor Charles Lee Ensminger, died of his wounds after the attack. The Panay herself, holed below the waterline by near-miss bomb detonations and by at least 1 direct hit, settled to the bottom of the Yangtze in 14 feet of water at approximately 1,530 hours. The survivors made their way to shore in lifeboats and on improvised rafts, where they were sheltered by Chinese villagers until American and British vessels were able to reach them. The immediate American diplomatic response was swift and unusually direct. Secretary of State Cordell Hull instructed the American ambassador in Tokyo, Joseph Clark Grew, to present a formal demand to the Japanese government requiring an apology, payment of indemnities, and guarantees against future incidents. The demand was delivered on December 14, 1937. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in his own message to the Japanese government, described the attack as inexcusable and demanded the full response that Hull had outlined. The language was strong. The implication of what would follow if the Japanese government did not respond adequately was left unstated, but was understood by both parties to the exchange. The Roosevelt administration's actual options in December of 1937 were considerably more constrained than the vigor of the initial diplomatic language suggested. American public opinion in 1937 was dominated by isolationism in a form that was not merely the passive preference of a population that did not wish to be drawn into foreign conflicts, but the active, organized, politically powerful conviction that American involvement in European or Asian wars was both avoidable and wrong. The Neutrality Acts of 1935, 1936, and 1937 had been passed with strong public and congressional support and reflected a reading of the First World War's origins that attributed American entry into that conflict largely to the influence of arms merchants and bankers with financial stakes in Allied victory. The Nye Committee hearings of the mid-1930s had given this interpretation a prominent platform, and its conclusions had shaped the legislative response in ways that severely constrained the executive branch's freedom of action in foreign policy. Roosevelt had tested the limits of this public mood only 2 months before the Panay attack, in his quarantine speech of October 5, 1937, in which he had suggested that the aggressor nations of Europe and Asia, Germany, Italy, and Japan, represented an epidemic of international lawlessness that the world's peace-loving nations had an interest in containing, just as a public health community sought to quarantine the sources of an epidemic. The speech's reception had been deeply discouraging to Roosevelt. The reaction from the press and from congressional leaders had been sharply negative, with accusations that the president was seeking to involve the United States in foreign entanglements that the public had clearly rejected. Roosevelt backed away from the speech within days of delivering it, denying that he had intended anything specific by the quarantine analogy. The episode had made it clear to him that the political constraints on his freedom of action in foreign policy were real and binding. Against this background, the Panay attack produced a public reaction that was more complicated than a straightforward demand for retribution. Polls conducted in the days following the attack showed that while a large majority of Americans were angered by what had happened, an equally large majority was opposed to any response that might lead to war with Japan. The Gallup polling organization found that approximately 70% of Americans believed the United States should withdraw entirely from China rather than risk conflict over its presence there. The sentiment was not without logic given the historical context. The American treaty rights in China that the Panay's presence had been asserting were themselves artifacts of a 19th century imperialism that a significant portion of the American public had ambivalent feelings about. The question of whether the United States should fight a war to maintain the right to station gunboats on Chinese rivers was one that the American public in 1937 answered with a fairly clear negative. Congress, reading the same public mood, produced in January of 1938 the Ludlow Amendment, a proposed constitutional amendment that would have required a national referendum before the United States could declare war, except in cases of direct attack on American territory. The amendment was proposed by Representative Lewis Ludlow of Indiana and reflected the depth of isolationist sentiment in the legislative branch. Roosevelt lobbied vigorously against it, understanding correctly that its passage would have effectively transferred the war-making power from the executive and legislative branches to a popular vote mechanism that could only operate after the weeks of public deliberation required to conduct a referendum. The amendment failed in the House by a narrow margin of 209 to 188, a vote that illustrated just how close the political balance stood between the internationalist position that Roosevelt represented and the isolationist position that a substantial portion of the Congress reflected. The Japanese government's response to the American demands was, in the event, faster and more formally satisfactory than many observers had expected. The Japanese Foreign Minister, Koki Hirota, delivered a formal apology to Ambassador Grew on December 14th, within 24 hours of the American demand. The Japanese government expressed sincere regrets and offered assurances that the responsible officers would be disciplined and that indemnities would be paid to the American government. The specific amount of the indemnity was subsequently negotiated and settled at $2,193,000, a figure that represented the assessed value of the Panay, the 3 Standard oil tankers that had also been sunk in the attack, the property of the Americans aboard, and additional amounts for personal injuries. The payment was made in full in April of 1938. The formal satisfactoriness of the Japanese response was not the same thing as a convincing explanation of what had actually happened. The Japanese government's initial explanation was that the attack had been an accident, that the pilots had not been able to identify the Panay as an American vessel, that the visible American flags had not been seen or had been obscured by smoke, that the attack had been conducted in good faith as part of operations against Chinese military forces. This explanation was received with considerable skepticism in Washington, not least because the motion picture film shot by Alley and Mayall was made available to government and press viewers within days of the attack, and showed, with the unambiguous clarity of motion picture imagery, American flags plainly visible on the vessel being attacked. The deeper question of whether the attack was truly accidental or represented some degree of deliberate intention by some element of the Japanese military has been examined by historians using Japanese records that became available after the war. The evidence that has emerged is ambiguous in its details, but suggestive in its overall direction. The Japanese Navy pilots who conducted the attack were experienced and trained to identify naval vessels by type and nationality. The American flags on the Panay were large and had been specifically positioned to maximize their visibility from the air. The position of the Panay had been communicated to Japanese military authorities. The weight of the evidence suggests that at least some of the officers involved in authorizing or conducting the attack knew or should have known that they were attacking an American vessel. The most persuasive explanation that historians have constructed is that elements of the Japanese military in the Nanking area in December of 1937 were operating with a degree of autonomy from the civilian government in Tokyo that made the distinction between official policy and field initiative extremely difficult to maintain. The Japanese army in China had developed a pattern of taking actions that exceeded or contradicted civilian government policy and then presenting the government with facts on the ground that could not be undone. The Kwantung Army's seizure of Manchuria in 1931, conducted without authorization from Tokyo and subsequently ratified by a government that had no practical means of reversing what had been done, was the most prominent example of this pattern. The attack on the Panay may have represented a similar dynamic at a smaller scale, an action taken by field commanders who calculated that American public opinion and Roosevelt's political constraints would prevent any serious retaliation, and that the diplomatic cost would be manageable. If that calculation was made, it was correct in the immediate term. The apology was accepted. The indemnity was paid. The Panay survivors were repatriated. The newsreel footage of the attack, which briefly made the rounds of American movie theaters, was pulled from distribution after several theaters reported that audiences watching it reacted not with anger toward Japan, but with demonstrations of support for withdrawal from China. The incident subsided from public attention within weeks, displaced by other news and by the calculated decision of the Roosevelt administration not to press the matter beyond the formal diplomatic resolution that had been achieved. Ambassador Grew, who had been in Tokyo for 4 years by the time of the Panay incident and who had developed a sophisticated understanding of Japanese political dynamics, wrote in his diary in the days following the attack that the incident had revealed something important about the character of Japanese-American relations that both governments would need to reckon with eventually. His specific concern was not about the Panay itself, but about the broader pattern it represented. The steady encroachment of Japanese military power into areas that American interests and treaty rights had previously occupied, the willingness of Japanese field commanders to take actions that challenged American positions, and the demonstrated fact that the American political system in its current configuration would not respond to those challenges with force. Grew was describing what students of international relations have called a credibility problem, the gap between a nation's stated interests and the will and capacity to defend them. The United States had treaty rights in China, maintained a naval presence on the Yangtze River to demonstrate those rights, and flew its flag over its vessels to make those rights visible. When the flag was attacked and the vessel sunk, the United States accepted an apology and monetary compensation. The lesson available to any careful observer of this sequence was that American rights in China could be challenged at a cost that was diplomatic and financial rather than military, and that the political constraints operating on the Roosevelt administration made a military response effectively impossible, short of a provocation so severe and so unambiguous that public opinion would overcome its fundamental reluctance to go to war. The lesson was drawn. In the years between December of 1937 and December of 1941, Japanese military policy in Asia continued to expand in ways that challenged American interests and treaty rights at every stage. The expansion of Japanese control in China, the movement into French Indochina in 1940, the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy also signed in 1940, the further movement into southern Indochina in 1941, each step was read in Washington as further evidence of Japanese expansionist ambitions, and each step produced American responses that fell short of military confrontation. The American responses included diplomatic protests, economic measures beginning with restrictions on exports of scrap metal and aviation fuel, and eventually the comprehensive oil embargo of August 1941 that cut off Japan's primary external source of the petroleum products her industrial and military economy required. The oil embargo was the decisive pressure that, from the Japanese perspective, made the choice between war and accommodation unavoidable. Japan imported approximately 80% of her oil from the United States. The embargo created a timetable. Japanese oil reserves at the rate of consumption required to maintain ongoing military operations would be exhausted in approximately 18 months. The Japanese government's calculation, made through the autumn of 1941, was that accepting American demands for withdrawal from China and cessation of southward expansion would be politically impossible domestically and would represent the abandonment of strategic gains that had been purchased at enormous cost in Japanese blood and treasure over a decade of continental warfare. The alternative was a rapid seizure of the oil resources of the Dutch East Indies, which required first eliminating the American Pacific Fleet as a threat to the long sea lines of communication that would connect Japan to those oil fields. The men in Tokyo who made that calculation in November of 1941 were working within a framework of assumptions about American will and American capacity that the Panay incident had helped to shape. They had observed 4 years earlier that an unambiguous attack on an American government vessel had produced an apology and a payment, and no military response. They had observed the quarantine speech and its retraction, the Ludlow Amendment's near passage, the consistent polling data showing American public opposition to foreign entanglement. They had constructed an assessment of American political will that concluded the United States would not fight for China, would not fight for Southeast Asia, and might not fight even for the Philippines. The question that Pearl Harbor was designed to answer was whether the United States would fight for its Pacific Fleet, and whether eliminating that fleet at the outset of hostilities would give Japan time to consolidate its new empire before American industrial capacity and American political will could be mobilized for a counteroffensive. The assessment was wrong, in ways that the Panay incident had also partially foreshadowed. The filmed evidence of the Panay attack had produced, alongside the dominant sentiment of withdrawal from China, a secondary reaction of genuine anger that represented something real in the American political character. The sense that there were limits beyond which provocation became intolerable, and that those limits were set not merely by rational calculation of national interest, but by a moral framework that distinguished between absorbing diplomatic insults and absorbing deliberate violence against American personnel. The Panay attack had not crossed that threshold in December of 1937, partly because the damage was limited, partly because the Japanese apology was rapid and formally satisfactory, and partly because the political moment was not right. Pearl Harbor crossed the threshold unambiguously and at a scale that left no room for the political calculations that had constrained the response to the Panay. The same American public that had responded to the Panay by polling in favor of withdrawal from China responded to Pearl Harbor with a unity of purpose and a sustained commitment to military action that overrode every other consideration. The isolationism that had been politically dominant in 1937 was politically dead within 24 hours of December 7, 1941. The Japanese planners who had factored American isolationism into their strategic calculations had built their plan on a foundation that the nature of the Pearl Harbor attack itself destroyed. The Panay herself remains on the bottom of the Yangtze River, where she sank in December of 1937. The precise condition of her remains is unknown, as access to the site has been limited by political and practical considerations throughout the decades since the war. The Yangtze River has been substantially modified by Chinese engineering projects, including the Three Gorges Dam, and the river conditions in the area of the sinking have changed from what they were in 1937. Whether the wreck is intact, partially buried in the river sediment, or dispersed by the currents and engineering work of 8 decades, cannot be determined from available sources. The motion picture film shot by Ali and Mayel during the attack was preserved and has been available to historians and to the public in various forms since the end of the war. It is a remarkable document, 17 minutes of footage showing an American government vessel under air attack, with the American flags plainly visible, the water columns of near-miss bombs rising around the hull, the wounded men on the decks. The footage has been used in documentaries and historical programs and is accessible in the collections of the National Archives. It is one of the very few examples of combat film from that period in which the event documented had direct diplomatic consequences while the film was still being developed. The survivors of the Panay attack scattered through the subsequent years of the war. Lieutenant Commander Hughes, wounded in the attack, recovered and continued his naval career. The enlisted men who had been on the Panay found themselves, as the war they had witnessed from a distance in December of 1937 came directly to the United States 4 years later, serving in the vastly expanded Navy that mobilized for the Pacific conflict. Some of them were interviewed by historians in the decades after the war and spoke about the attack with a clarity that time had sharpened rather than blurred. The experience of being on an American vessel flying American flags that was attacked by aircraft of a nation with which America was not at war was not one that the men who had lived it found easy to categorize or to explain to those who had not been there. The diplomatic officials who had managed the crisis, Grew in Tokyo and Hull in Washington and Roosevelt at the White House, also continued in their positions through the subsequent years and eventually through the war that the Panay incident had prefigured without producing. Grew remained in Tokyo as ambassador until the day after Pearl Harbor, when diplomatic relations were severed and he was interned briefly before being repatriated. His diary entries from those years constitute one of the most valuable primary source records of American-Japanese relations in the period, and his analysis of the Panay incident and its implications was prescient in ways that the subsequent history confirmed. Hull remained Secretary of State through the entirety of the war, the longest-serving person in that office in American history, and it was Hull who, on November 26, 1941, delivered to the Japanese ambassadors the document that became known as the Hull Note, a comprehensive restatement of American demands for Japanese withdrawal from China and Indochina that the Japanese government read as an ultimatum and that contributed to the final decision to proceed with the Pearl Harbor attack. The connection between the man who had drafted the American demands following the Panay attack in December of 1937 and the man who delivered the document that preceded Pearl Harbor in November of 1941 was the same man, working within a framework of American policy toward Japan that the Panay incident had helped to define. The Panay incident occupies a specific and under-examined position in the history of the road to the Pacific War. It was not a cause of the war in any direct mechanical sense. It was something more subtle, a moment of clarity about the nature of Japanese-American relations that both governments observed, drew conclusions from, and acted upon in ways that shaped the subsequent 4 years. The Japanese government observed that the United States would accept a diplomatic settlement for an attack on an American naval vessel if the formal requirements of apology and compensation were met. The Roosevelt administration observed that the American political system, in its current configuration, would not support a military response to Japanese aggression short of a direct and massive attack on American forces. Both observations were correct, and both influenced the decisions made in the years that followed. The small gunboat on the Yangtze River, with her American flags and her 3-inch guns and her 60 crewmen and the journalists who happened to be aboard that Sunday afternoon, had for a few weeks in December of 1937 been the most watched vessel in the world. The crisis she produced had shown both the United States and Japan things about themselves and about each other that neither entirely welcomed. The showing had not been enough to change the fundamental direction of events. 4 years later, in different waters and on a vastly different scale, the reckoning that the Panay incident had deferred arrived.